the gospel of love meets the gospel of greed, also known as, or AKA, the gospel and the economy. The gospel of love meets the gospel of greed. The passage we read that was Zach this morning is considered one of the most difficult parables of Jesus to understand. Think about it. Why in the world is Jesus teaching a lesson in which a plainly unscrupulous money manager was commended by his wealthy employer for more dishonesty? When the manager wrote down debts his employer was owed by others, knowing he was about to be fired. Figure that out, okay? Why is that moral? In this lesson, Jesus spoke about a man who was accused of mismanaging, squandering the business interests of his wealthy employer. The guy was about to be fired. The lesson plainly says, give me an accounting of your management because you cannot be my manager any longer. This guy was about to get a pink slip. Okay? After he realized he was about to be fired, the manager decided to ingratiate himself to people who owed his employer by marking down what these people owed. These folks owed his boss money. Knowing he was about to be fired, he goes and writes down the debts so he can get in good with them. What's honest? Jesus commends this guy, okay? The manager reduced what one person owed his boss by half. The guy owed 100 jugs of olive oil, and he says, write yours down to 50. Another one he reduces by a fifth. A guy owed 100 containers of wheat. He said, write yours down to 80. Now that puts a brand new take on the flashing blue light at Kmart, okay? I mean, and Jesus commends this guy. At this point, the parable becomes even more complicated because it really becomes morally confusing. Because Jesus says the manager, quote, the employer commended the dishonest manager because he had acted shrewdly. Jesus' words. And then Jesus commented, quote, the children of this age are more shrewd in dealing with their generation than are the children of light. Are you confused yet? Are you confused yet? Let me go deeper. The moral of the parable takes another confusing turn by the next sentence attributed by Jesus. I tell you, make friends for yourselves by means of dishonest wealth, so that when it is gone, they may welcome you into the eternal home. Now, you teach that. Okay? You're probably wondering, well, preacher, why did you choose to preach on that? It's not hard to make sense of the next statements Jesus makes. Whoever is faithful in a very little is faithful also in much. Whoever is dishonest in a very little is also dishonest in much. Jesus explained that one with this summary at verses 10 through 12. If then you have not been faithful with the dishonest wealth, who will entrust to you the true riches? And if you have not been faithful with what belongs to another, who will give you what is your own? Now, many people, including people who are not followers of Jesus, are familiar with what appears to be the conclusion of the parable at verse 13. No slave can serve two masters. How many times have we heard that? For a slave will either hate the one and love the other, or be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and wealth. We've heard that. But how does that conclusion apply to the other parts of the parable? Was the dishonest manager serving God or serving wealth by slashing the debts owed to the rich man who was about to fire him? When he did so for the purpose of getting in good with the folks whose debts he was cutting. And even if the amounts owed were unfair or were otherwise improper, why did the manager's boss commend him for not collecting what was owed after having served him with a termination notice because he mismanaged other accounts? This is a good one, isn't it? I mean, this one doesn't have any easy answers. And how does the example of a dishonest employee who used his position to be even more unfaithful by writing down what his employer was owed show what faithfulness means? How do you prove what faithfulness means? By using an example of somebody who has been A, dishonest, B, about to be fired for dishonesty or incompetence, and C, then becomes more dishonest by cheating his boss out of what he's owed. Now, how does Jesus get off by saying that's an example of faithfulness? I mean, that's plainly what you got here, okay? The longer one ponders this parable, the more perplexing it seems. What's commendable about taking what belongs to someone else, the manager's conduct in writing down what his employer was owed in olive oil and wheat, to confer a benefit, the debt reduction, to the people who owed the wheat and the olive oil, so one can be friends with the folks whose debts you cut? What's commendable about that? What's the moral worth of friendship based on stealing from one person in order to get in good with another person? Were the people whose debts were reduced by the dishonest manager being dishonest themselves by taking the write-downs? Hello? I owe Earl money. Okay? I owe Earl money. Earl owes Malik money. Malik's about to jump on Earl because Malik's not getting paid. So Earl goes and says, listen, I know you owe Malik. I'm going to take some of what you owe Malik off. This is what Jesus tells us about here. You can't read, this is in the red letters, folks, okay? You can't read this out of the Bible. I know you're trying to figure out how to get out of it. You can't read this out. King James Version, you got any King James Version? It's there, right? NIV is there, right? NRSV is there, right? Living Bible is there. I care whatever, or what folks you say, whatsoever version you got is in there. Now, deal with this. Let me introduce you to Reverend Dr. Stephanie Buchanan Crowder, who is an ordained Baptist and Disciples of Christ minister who teaches New Testament at Belmont University and has a PhD in religion from Vanderbilt University. Dr. Crowder has written that, quote, while many have termed the manager dishonest, he merely employs capitalistic bartering for the sake of his personal well-being. He does what he has seen his supervisor do in order to survive. Luke makes it clear that there is a system of financial exploitation in place, a system of financial exploitation in place. And Luke encourages those in his community to do what they have heard and seen the rich do in order to survive. Close quote. Dr. Crowder cites Professor Justin Upkong, U-P-K-O-N-G, one of the pioneers of African biblical scholarship, for an interpretation of this parable that sheds a more favorable light on the manager based on the situation of African peasant farmers who are indebted to rich produce traders. The produce traders have managers under them who loan the farmers money for medical expenses or school fees for the children and charge interest on those loans of between 50 and 100%. Based on the situation for those peasant farmers, Professor Upkong commented, quote, "The rich man in the story is not the benevolent grand personage he's often thought to be, but an exploiter. The reading has also concluded that the manager of the estate is not the villain, but the hero of the story," close quote. Then Dr. Crowder adds the following commentary. This reading brings to life not only the image of African peasant farmers, but also the plight of African American farmers, the plight of African American families, and the plight of African Americans who have lost faith in the American justice system. Fearing hunger and homelessness, many use a well-established, corrupt system in order to survive and meet everyday needs. For example, supposedly retired senior citizens receiving Social Security checks find themselves working in order to supplement their income because these monthly checks are not enough to meet their needs. Yet any supplemental income is subject to taxes that seniors cannot afford. So the seniors receive the funds from those extra jobs in cash or, quote, under the table. Hello? Oh, you having trouble with the parable now? Is the parable making a little bit more sense to you now? Could it be that this parable only seems complicated because our religious views are more strongly influenced by the gospel of greed and capitalism than by the gospel of divine love and compassion for people who need deliverance from financial oppression? What oppression are we choosing not to see when we read this parable? Are we choosing not to see an economy where wealthy people use middle managers to oppress others? Are we choosing not to consider that the dishonest manager may have decided to write off what were oppressive debts owed his employer before he was dismissed because he realized if the guy was quick enough to make me charge these folks money, I ought to at least be honest enough to let him get off. I'm going to be fired anyway. Why should I let him get this crooked money? Are we choosing not to see what this parable says about an economic system where people become wealthy and remain wealthy by using money and the threat to withhold money as tools, as weapons, as instruments to oppress others? You recall the student loan interest payments that are charged to college students, and we found out that the interest payments are jacked up through dummy companies. Do you recall the home loans that were given to low-income people at different kind of rates? And then when the housing bubble went down, the interest rates jumped up, and they wound up underwater. And the banks who got the housing bubble messed up got bailouts, and the folks who got underwater on their loans are stuck in foreclosure. Are we choosing not to see that? Are we choosing not to see what this parable says about a U.S. economy built on enslaving Africans and expanded by terrorism and massacre and land fraud, as Josh mentioned, against Native Americans? stealing their land and stealing their water, and then accusing them of being savages. That's the word that Thomas Jefferson used for them in the Declaration of Independence now. Jefferson called them savages. Oh, we stole their land, we stole their water, and they're the savages. Are we choosing not to remember that Arizona and Nevada and Colorado and New Mexico were part of Mexico, as was Texas? And the Mexican didn't invite us. They did not invite, come liberate us from Mexico. Hello? Are we choosing not to realize that our economy was built on fraud, terrorism, theft? Are we choosing to not see what this parable says about a railroad system and a mining industry established and expanded by mistreating immigrants from Asia and from South America and the West Indies and Europe? Are we choosing to commit the mistake made by the lectionary committee? When you look at the passage that is assigned to today for by the lectionary committee, the committee that assigns the 4-year readings for churches, they didn't add the last 2 verses I put in there. They left out verses 14 and 15. The lectionary committee ends the lesson at verse 13. But look at verses 14 and 15. Jesus spoke this parable knowing that there were certain people overhearing, and this is what he said to the Pharisees. The Pharisees at verse 14, who were lovers of money, heard all this, and they ridiculed him. So he said to them, you are those who justify yourselves in the sight of others, but God knows your hearts. For what is prized by human beings is an abomination in the sight of God. Close quote. Now, how many times have you heard economic oppression being called an abomination? Or you've heard other stuff being called an abomination, haven't you? But when's the last time you heard economic oppression being called an abomination? Jesus says economic oppression is an abomination in the sight of God, and Jesus knows the heart. Why is it that the lectionary committee doesn't put this part in? The folks in charge of choosing what we read. Well, your bootleg preacher has something to tell you. What Jesus is telling us in this parable is that worshiping wealth is an abomination in the sight of God. It didn't say that being wealthy was. It said worshiping wealth. Hello? It said worshiping wealth. That should make us think about how wealth is worshiped so much. Everybody talks about how nice it is to be the Waltons, especially in Arkansas. We want to go to Crystal Bridges and see Crystal Bridges. The Walton family fortune exists because Sam Walton, his family, and the people who invested in Walmart stock, the Walton corporate empire, cheated their workers. Remember, they call them associates. For decades, by paying them low wages and by denying health benefits. So much so that folks who were working at Walmart while Sam Walton was moving from a struggling entrepreneur to a millionaire and then a billionaire were on food stamps. By omitting verses 14 and 15 from this lectionary reading, the lectionary committee dodged this question: who are the Pharisees among us? Jesus said this so he could tell the disciples something, but he knew the Pharisees listened. So who are the Pharisees among us? The gospel of divine love we see in Jesus denounced religious people who ridiculed debt forgiveness. The Pharisees were ridiculing Jesus for praising debt forgiveness. Who are the folks among us who ridicule, who down-talk debt forgiveness? Who are the Pharisees now who ridicule forgiving student loan debt? You recall when Bernie Sanders talked about people going to college for free? You recall how folks said he was unrealistic, called him a socialist? A lot of those folks were church folk. Saved and sanctified, born-again, believing folk. Christian evangelists. Evangelist. I said evangelist. I didn't say evangelicals. I said evangelists because, you see, they get it all twisted. Who were the Pharisees who refused to forgive home mortgage debts for homeowners who are upside down on their home mortgage for balloon payments, but who wanted to bail out Bank of America, Goldman Sachs? Who are the religious people who say that helping people who need social services is being fiscally irresponsible, but that giving tax breaks to millionaires is sowing seeds of economic prosperity? Hello? Who are the Pharisees today who help real estate developers and speculators take over neighborhoods from low-income homeowners in the name of gentrification? Hello? Who are the Pharisees who vote for politicians to authorize increasing military spending and slashing social spending for people who are homeless, people who are sick, people who are aged, people who are unemployed, people who are widowed, who are orphaned, who are otherwise vulnerable? Who are the people who want to help rich people by using the taxes from poor people, but don't want to help poor people by telling rich people to pay taxes? Who are the people who are saying, I sure do like Donald Trump, but don't ask themselves, how did Donald Trump get to be rich? And righteous when his riches were obtained by discriminating against people who were black and immigrant? When his riches were obtained by cheating contractors who built the buildings he built and making them sue him and then charging them making them take pennies on the dollar, knowing he had platoons of lawyers who could wear them down. This is not a feel-good parable because it forces us to come face to face with the gospel of greed. The gospel of greed. And Jesus calls us to reject that gospel. Jesus declared that what Senator Bernie Sanders echoed during his presidential campaign was true. Remember, Bernie Sanders said, our economic system is rigged. And that's what this parable shows. Jesus says we've got a rigged economy. It is rigged to favor the greedy and oppress the needy. Jesus declared what Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said. I knew you were going to say, well, Bernie Sanders, we don't know if he's okay, because we don't know what his religion is, but you heard King, don't you? I think folks say King is he's a Christian preacher. Here's what Dr. King said in Where We Go From Here. This is not what you hear on King Day. Quote, for years, two groups in our society have been enjoyed a guaranteed income. Indeed, it is a symptom of our confused values that these two groups turn out to be the richest and the poorest. The wealthy who own securities have always had an assured income. And their polar opposite, the relief client, has always been guaranteed an income, however minuscule, through welfare benefits. The contemporary tendency in our society is to base our distribution on scarcity, which has vanished, and to compress our abundance into the overfed mouths of the middle and upper classes until they gag. And then King says, if democracy is to have any breath of meaning, it is necessary to adjust this inequity. It is not only moral, it is also intelligent. The curse of poverty is socially as cruel as blind as the practice of cannibalism at the dawn of civilization, when men ate each other because they had not yet learned to take food from the soil or to consume the abundant animal life around them. That's what Martin Luther King said. This parable really isn't puzzling. It just seems that way. Because our sense of God's truth and God's love and God's justice has become perverted, if not deadened, by greed and our acceptance of the idolatry of wealth and the way we glorify wealthy and wealth-surrounded people. Remember, lifestyles of the rich and famous. Remember, you can always get a good issue of Ebony or Jet showing somebody rich. Remember, everybody wants to see how Jay-Z and Beyonce are doing. Nobody thinks about the neighborhoods that Jay-Z is displaced by putting up the new place where the New York Kings play. We like to worship the rich. So this parable challenges us to have the courage to admit that Jesus has denounced the way we worship profit-making, capitalism, and the way our loan practices do violence to children of God who are like the debtors who owed the 100 jugs of olive oil and the 100 containers of wheat. This parable challenges us to see that when Jesus said that the rich man commended the manager for having acted shrewdly, Jesus suddenly was showing that the rich man was overcharging. The rich man wasn't losing money. If he was commending the manager for writing off half the debt one person owed and 1/5 of the debt another guy owed. He wasn't losing money. In this parable, the gospel of love meets the gospel of greed, and Jesus blesses Robin Hood. Put that in the Wall Street Journal. So which gospel are we following? Are we following the gospel of the Wall Street Journal or the gospel of Jesus? You do recall the Bible begins with people leaving slavery having taken from the people who enslaved them money that they gave them to leave. And the scripture says they plundered them. That was plunder. It makes a difference how you read Scripture. If you read Scripture from the perspective of the capitalist oppressor, you will read oppression as righteous. And you will read the subversion of oppression as stealing. Which gospel will we choose to follow after we reflect on this gospel? What will we do to relieve the economic oppression in our place, our time, our situations? God is waiting and watching to find out. You know what? So are our brothers and sisters.